The committee will come to order. Today, the committee will examine worldwide threats. I would like to welcome our witnesses, Director of National Intelligence, James Clapper, Director of the Central Intelligence Agency, John Brennan, Director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, James Comey, Deputy Director of the National Security Agency, Richard Leggett, Director of the Defense Intelligence Agency, Lieutenant General Vince Stewart, and Director of National Counterterrorism Center, Nick Rasmussen. Thank you all for being here today. I recognize the challenges associated with discussing sensitive national security issues in public, but I hope you agree that this open forum is critical to help explain to the American people the serious threats we face and also to highlight the efforts of the brave men and women of the intelligence community to keep us safe. I speak for the entire community when I thank you for your service, sacrifice, and dedication. Director Clapper, this is your last Worldwide Threats hearing with this committee. I'd like to especially thank you for your 55 years of service to this great nation. Director Clapper, I recall from last year's testimony that you were concerned about a vast array of threats. Remarkably, the number seems to have grown since then. Generally, I share your assessment of the current threat environment. The truth is, the United States faces the highest threat level since the 9/11 attacks. The American people don't need a security clearance to understand the threats now facing the Western world. They only need to read the headlines out of Paris, Brussels, San Bernardino, and Boston. Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and other terror groups are rapidly expanding, with more access to safe havens, recruits, and resources than ever before. Without U.S. leadership, this trend will continue. We have discussed Syria and Iraq with you at length in closed and open sessions. I believe the U.S. response to those conflicts is among the most mismanaged foreign policy blunders in recent history. After consistently failing to block ISIS's expansion, we have to accept a new reality. ISIS is now in dozens of countries and has repeatedly demonstrated the ability to reach our homeland. Instead of focusing on ISIS as if it were confined to Iraq and Syria, we urgently need an aggressive, comprehensive, and anti-terror strategy that stretches from Morocco to Southeast Asia. At the same time, our adversaries are becoming more diverse. Throughout the next decade, the U.S. must be prepared to check Chinese ambition in Asia, counter a resurgent Russia, defend against cyber threats, and manage delicate geopolitical forces in the Middle East, including the growing schism between Sunni and Shia Muslims. How does the President respond to these enormous challenges? His hallmark policy has been to strike a nuclear deal with Iran that greatly relieves pressure on the Iranian regime, the world's biggest state sponsor of terrorism. He also failed to prevent Russia from propping up Syrian dictator Bashar Assad, a man who the President himself has insisted must surrender power. Meanwhile, some of our closest allies in fighting terrorism, the Kurds, the Israelis, and the Egyptians, often find their concerns downplayed or dismissed within the administration. Our partners around the world want to work with us, but they can't rally behind American leadership if they don't understand what our foreign policy is trying to accomplish. Although I disagree with the President's policies, the committee will continue to provide the intelligence community with the resources it needs to protect the nation, with particular emphasis this year on preserving capabilities for the next president. Because the intelligence community is being stretched thin and is overwhelmed by a complex threat matrix, we must prioritize investments throughout the entire intelligence community. Our committee's mission is clear: to help the intelligence community to protect the American people by providing oversight, direction, and resources to enable effective, efficient, and constitutional intelligence activities. Additionally, amid the growing threats we face, it is critically important that we ensure the intelligence community act as careful steward of the taxpayers' dollars. Over the next year, our committee will focus on making progress in the following 5 key areas. First, encouraging efficient investment in areas such as space, in which complex program and capability requirements routinely drive up costs, and adopting new technology, including data analytics, encryption, and technical training, specifically in community-wide projects like cloud computing, data security, and tool management. Second, reassessing the effectiveness of the community's human intelligence enterprise and synchronizing community-wide resources, especially at a time when several intelligence community agencies are implementing reorganizational plans. This particularly applies to the recruitment, and training of the next generation of collectors, cyber experts, and analysts to operate in non-traditional areas and deliver intelligence on hard-to-reach targets. Third, producing objective and unbiased intelligence analysis, particularly in the Department of Defense, where there is a multi-committee effort to determine whether there are systematic problems across the intelligence enterprise in CENTCOM or any other pertinent intelligence organizations. In this context, it is vital that this committee protect and seriously consider the testimony of the many whistleblowers who have provided information to us. For example, we have been made aware that both files and emails have been deleted by personnel at CENTCOM, and we expect that the Department of Defense will provide these and all other relevant documents to the committee. Fourth, improving the efficiency of intelligence support to combatant commands, including efforts to curb facilities and personnel costs. It's alarming that this committee identified up to $50 million in annual savings for the Defense Intelligence Agency and more than $300 million in unneeded construction disguised as base consolidation. In total, this was $1.5 billion in savings for one project. The response we received from the administration can only be described as delay, denial, and deception. This has led the chairman of the Armed Services Committee, the chairman of the Defense Appropriations Committee, and me to ask the GAO to conduct a full investigation. Furthermore, whistleblowers have provided this committee with documentation showing that the Department of Defense has provided false information to Congress. This committee will now conduct another round of interviews and will turn over our findings to the House Committee on Oversight and Government Reform, which already has an ongoing investigation into this matter, and to the Department of Defense Inspector General. Finally, we've asked for data on all intelligence personnel and major support contractors at the combatant commands. This request was made in December, and this is information that should be readily available. Informants have made this committee aware that basing decisions at significant cost to the taxpayer are being determined in order to maximize pay and benefits of small groups of individuals. This includes both Department of Defense civilians and contractors. This brings into question hundreds of millions of dollars of contracts that are being awarded annually. Fifth, and finally, migrating cyber threats and improving cyber defense in light of the rapid pace of technological change. To address these problems, the committee helped pass the Cybersecurity Act of 2015. While the Director of National Intelligence is establishing the Cyber Threat Intelligence Information Center, we need to ensure that the new law is implemented properly and that the new center operates effectively. Additionally, the latest challenges the government has met in gaining access to the iPhone used by one of San Bernardino terrorists is emblematic of the growing problem posed by encryption. Finally, we need to educate members of Congress on the importance of reauthorization of Section 702 of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. I look forward to hearing what the witnesses have to contribute on these 5 focus areas. And with that, I'd like to recognize my ranking member, Mr. Schiff, for any comments he would like to make.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to join you in thanking our witnesses, Director Clapper, Director Brennan, Director Comey, Lieutenant General Stewart, Director Rasmussen, and Deputy Director Leggett. We are very grateful for your efforts and for those of the men and women of the intelligence community. The threats we face today are incredibly diverse and incredibly daunting. From cyber to terrorism, Russian aggression to North Korean nuclear belligerence, from threats to space to threats from below the sea, we are living in a very dangerous world. Because of technology, some of these threats are new. The Internet of Things, for example, presents unique vulnerabilities to the most advanced nations like us, as does the rise of artificial intelligence. Other threats are more traditional, but still potentially devastating. North Korea's January nuclear test and its recent space launch, Russia's interventions in Ukraine, Syria, and its threat to the Baltic states, China's activity in the South China Sea, and regional power struggles in the Middle East are a reminder that traditional state-based threats have not receded. Far from it, they are getting worse. Still, other threats are shifting. Even as coalition bombing has halted the group's expansion in Iraq and Syria, for example, ISIS has thrown off spores into places like Libya, and has sought to incite attacks in Europe, as we saw in Paris, and to inspire attacks here in the United States, as we saw in San Bernardino. Many of these threats are also interrelated. ISIS virulence is compounded by its use of technology, particularly social media and encrypted communications. Russia's terrestrial ambitions and China's naval designs are supported by a desire to counter the U.S. predominance in space, and our greatest cyber capabilities are also our greatest vulnerabilities. To navigate through these treacherous shoals, we look to the IC to sound the alarms, as you are doing today, and to find and enable solutions. After the Senate's version of this hearing earlier this month, many were saying that the world was going to hell in a handbasket, and I can certainly understand why, given the myriad of challenges that we face. But I want to emphasize here that we're highlighting these threats so we can discuss how best to counter them, and we have faced and overcome far greater challenges in the past. To that end, we've begun receiving and reviewing your budget submissions. We look forward to many more sessions with you to make sure you have what you need to protect against these threats, and to do so in a way that is lawful, protective of privacy and civil liberties, cost-effective, and in keeping with the highest of American values. Some solutions, particularly when it comes to the debate surrounding encryption, are not going to come easily. The simple fact is exemplified by this month's case involving Apple. One thing, however, is clear. The Court's ruling, even if narrowly tailored to particular facts of this case, will have ripple effects that will significantly impact the law enforcement community, the intelligence community, the business community, and all of us individually. This case and others like it implicate policy questions that can't be decided by the courts alone. Congress, through inclusive discussions with tech companies, interest groups, the public, the global community, law enforcement, and the intelligence community, and the White House, must carefully weigh the competing policy considerations and arrive at sensible solutions. As a first step, we need facts. That's why several months ago, Chairman Nunes and I asked the National Academy of Science for a report on this issue, which will be completed this year. It's also why I support a legislative commission on encryption and the President's broader cybersecurity commission. A hard look at the most commonly advanced claims on all sides of the encryption debate would move us further from abstractions and towards solutions. As a second step, we need to honestly acknowledge the complexity and not engage in absolutes. As this committee has shown with its leadership on surveillance reform and cyber information sharing legislation, privacy and liberty can and must coexist. There is no doubt that terrorists are exploiting cheap and widely available encryption technology to do us harm, and they'll continue to do so. At the same time, there's no doubt that our cybersecurity and our privacy are under relentless attack from nation state and criminal hackers, and greater encryption provides a key defense. We can all agree that law enforcement and the intelligence community have an obligation to investigate crimes and prevent harm to Americans. Similarly, there is no doubt that American companies have obligations to their shareholders to maximize profits in an increasingly competitive global world, and to their customers to safeguard privacy. Our job in Congress is to reconcile these legitimate obligations and priorities. It is our job to draw lines. I'm not advocating a broad mandate on decryption, but nor do I favor a world where law enforcement is completely shut out of illicit communications when they have a court-approved warrant. What I am advocating is for a cooperative, fact-based approach to solving this very real problem. Congress can pose the solution if it must, but it would be far better for us to arrive at a resolution through a negotiation with all of the stakeholders that sets the standard for best practices and one that we can live with here at home and champion around the world. Yes, we are living in a dangerous world, as well as a complex world, make no mistake about it, but it's also a world of great opportunity. Some of the challenges we have today, like that presented by encryption, are born of the incredible talent, creativity, and innovation of American businesses that are solving problems every day. We also have the best intelligence community in the world working tirelessly to make sure these advances are not used to propagate hate, violence, and terror through channels that are beyond reach. The challenges and the answer to these challenges lies in finding solutions together. I thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I believe, Mr. Clapper, you have an opening statement. I think you're going to speak for the entire panel.
Yes, sir, that's right.
Well, Mr. Clapper, I want to again thank you for your 55 years of service. I don't know if this is your last Worldwide Threats hearing, but if it is, I'm sure you're happy about that, at least publicly. And with that, you're recognized.
Yes, I am. Chairman Nunes, ranking membership, and members of the committee, we're here today to update you on some, but certainly not all of the pressing intelligence and national security issues facing our nation. So in the interest of time to get to your questions, I'll cover just some of the wave tops, and as you indicated, mine will be the only opening statement. And we'll be back next week. I will be on the 3rd of March to address the budget and management issues that you raised, Chairman Nunes. As I said last year, unpredictable instability has become the new normal, and this trend will continue, we think, for the foreseeable future. Violent extremists are operationally active in about 40 countries. 7 countries are experiencing a collapse of central government authority, and 14 others face regime-threatening or violent instability or both. Another 59 countries face a significant risk of instability through 2016. The record level of migrants, more than 1 million, arriving in Europe is likely to grow further this year. Migration and displacement will strain countries in Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Americas. Some 60 million people are considered displaced globally, the most since the end of World War II, when the United Nations first started keeping such records. Extreme weather, climate change, environmental degradation, rising demand for food and water, poor policy decisions, and inadequate infrastructure will magnify that instability. Infectious diseases and vulnerabilities of the global supply chain for medical countermeasures will continue to pose threats. For example, the Zika virus, first detected in the Western Hemisphere in 2014, has reached the United States and is projected to cause up to 4 million cases in this hemisphere. With that preface, I want to briefly comment on both technology and cyber. Technological innovation during the next few years will have an even more significant impact on our way of life. This innovation is central to our economic prosperity, but it will bring new security vulnerabilities. The Internet of Things will connect tens of billions of new physical devices that could be exploited. Artificial intelligence will enable computers to make autonomous decisions about data and physical systems and potentially disrupt labor markets. Russia and China continue to have the most sophisticated cyber programs. China continues cyber espionage against the United States, and whether their commitment of last September moderates its economic espionage remains to be seen. Iran and North Korea continue to conduct cyber espionage as they enhance their attack capabilities. Non-state actors also pose cyber threats. ISIL has used cyber to its great advantage, not only for recruitment and propaganda, but also to hack and release sensitive information about U.S. military personnel. As a non-state actor, ISIL displays unprecedented online proficiency. Cyber criminals remain the most pervasive cyber threat to the U.S. financial sector. They use cyber to conduct theft, extortion, and other criminal activities. Turning to terrorism, there are now more Sunni violent extremist groups, members, and safe havens than at any time in history. The rate of foreign fighters traveling to the conflict zones in Syria and Iraq in the past few years is without precedent. At least 38,200 foreign fighters, including at least 6,900 from Western countries, have traveled to Syria from at least 120 countries since the beginning of the conflict in 2012. As we saw in the November Paris attacks, returning foreign fighters with first-hand battlefield experience pose a dangerous operational threat. ISIL has demonstrated sophisticated attack tactics and tradecraft, as we saw. ISIL, including its 8 established and several more emerging branches, has become the preeminent global terrorist threat. ISIL has attempted or conducted scores of attacks outside of Syria and Iraq in the past 15 months. ISIL's estimated strength now exceeds that globally of al-Qaeda. ISIL's leaders seek to strike the U.S. homeland beyond inspiring homegrown violent extremist attacks. Although the U.S. is a harder target than Europe, ISIL external operations remain a critical factor in our threat assessment for 2016. Al-Qaeda's affiliates also have proven resilient. Despite counterterrorism pressure that's largely decimated the core leadership in Afghanistan and Pakistan, al-Qaeda affiliates are positioned to make gains in 2016. Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula and the al-Nusra Front, the al-Qaeda chapter in Syria, are the 2 most capable al-Qaeda branches. The increased use by violent extremists of encrypted and secure internet and mobile-based technology enables terrorist actors to go dark and serves to undercut intelligence and law enforcement efforts. Iran continues to be the foremost state sponsor of terrorism and exert its influence in regional crises in the Mideast through the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Quds Force, its terrorist partner Lebanese Hezbollah, and proxy groups. Iran and Hezbollah remain a continuing terrorist threat to U.S. interests and partners worldwide. We saw firsthand the threat posed in the United States by homegrown violent extremists in the July attack in Chattanooga and the attack in San Bernardino. In 2014, the FBI arrested 9 ISIL supporters. In 2015, that number increased more than fivefold. Moving to weapons of mass destruction, North Korea continues to conduct test activities of concern to the United States. Earlier this month, Pyongyang conducted a satellite launch and subsequently claimed that the satellite was successfully placed in orbit. Additionally, in January, North Korea carried out its 4th nuclear test, claiming it was a hydrogen bomb, but the yield was too low for it to have been a successful test of a staged thermonuclear device. Pyongyang continues to produce fissile material and develop a submarine-launched ballistic missile. It's also committed to developing a long-range nuclear-armed missile that's capable of posing a direct threat to the United States, although the system has not been flight tested. Despite its economic challenges, Russia continues its aggressive military modernization program. It has the largest and most capable foreign nuclear-armed ballistic missile force. It has developed a cruise missile that violates the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces, or INF Treaty. China continues to modernize its nuclear missile force and is striving for a secure second strike capability. It continues to profess a no first use doctrine. The Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or JCPOA, provides us greater transparency into Iran's fissile material production. It increases the time the Iranians would need to produce enough weapons-grade uranium for a nuclear weapon from a few months to about a year. Iran probably views the JCPOA as a means to remove sanctions while preserving nuclear capabilities. Its perception of how the JCPOA helps it achieve its overall strategic goals will dictate its level of adherence to the agreement over time. Thus far, the Iranians appear to be in compliance. Chemical weapons continue to pose a threat in Syria and Iraq. Damascus has used chemicals against the opposition on multiple occasions since Syria joined the Chemical Weapons Convention. ISIL has also used toxic chemicals in Iraq and Syria, including the blister agent sulfur mustard, the first time an extremist group has produced and used a chemical warfare agent in an attack since Shamriko used sarin in Japan in 1995. In the space and counterspace realm, about 80 countries now are engaged in the space domain. Russia and China understand how our military fights and how heavily we rely on space. They're each pursuing destructive and disruptive anti-satellite systems. China continues to make progress on its anti-satellite missile program. Moving to counterintelligence, the threat from foreign intelligence entities, both state and non-state, is persistent, complex, and evolving. Targeting collection of U.S. political, military, economic, and technical information by foreign intelligence services continue unabated. Russia and China pose the greatest threat, followed by Iran and Cuba on a lesser scale. As well, the threat from insiders taking advantage of their access to collect and remove sensitive national security information will remain a persistent challenge. With respect to transnational organized crime, I do want to touch on one crime issue, specifically drug trafficking. Southwest border seizures of heroin in the United States have doubled since 2010. Over 10,000 people died of heroin overdoses in 2014, much of it laced with fentanyl, which is 30 to 50 times more potent than heroin. In that same year, more than 28,000 died from opioid overdoses. Cocaine production in Colombia, from which most U.S. supplies originate, has increased significantly. Now let me quickly move through a few regional issues. In East Asia, China's leaders are pursuing an active foreign policy while dealing with much slower economic growth. Chinese leaders have also embarked on the most ambitious military reforms in its history. Regional tension will continue as China pursues construction of its outposts in the South China Sea. Russia has demonstrated its military capabilities to project itself as a global power, command respect from the West, maintain domestic support for the regime, and advance Russian interests globally. Moscow's objectives in Ukraine will probably remain unchanged, including maintaining long-term influence over Kiev and frustrating its attempt to integrate into Western institutions. Putin is the first leader since Stalin to expand Russia's territory. Moscow's military venture into Syria marks its first use since its foray into Afghanistan of significant expeditionary combat power outside the post-Soviet space. Its interventions demonstrate the improvements in Russian military capabilities and the Kremlin's confidence of using them. Moscow faces the reality, however, of economic recession driven in large part by falling oil prices as well as sanctions. Russia's nearly 4% GDP contraction last year will probably extend into 2016. In the Mideast and South Asia, there are more cross-border military operations underway in the Mideast region than at any time since the 1973 Arab-Israeli War. In Iraq, anti-ISIL forces will probably make incremental gains through the spring, similar to those made in Baji and Ramadi in the past few months. ISIL is now somewhat on the defensive, and its territory and manpower are shrinking, but it remains a formidable threat. In Syria, pro-regime forces have the initiative, having made some strategic gains near Aleppo and Latakia in the north, as well as in southern Syria. Manpower shortages will continue to undermine the Syrian regime's ability to accomplish strategic battlefield objectives. The opposition has less equipment and firepower, and its groups lack unity. They sometimes have competing battlefield interests and fight among themselves. Some 250,000 have been killed as this war has dragged on, which is probably a low side estimate. Meanwhile, the humanitarian situation in Syria continues to deteriorate. As of last month, there are approximately 4.4 million Syrian refugees and another 6.5 million internally displaced persons, which together represent about half of Syria's pre-conflict population. In Libya, despite the December agreement to form a new government and national accord, establishing authority and security across the country will be difficult, with hundreds of militia groups operating throughout the country. ISIL has established its most developed branch outside of Syria and Iraq in Libya and maintains a presence in Sirte, Benghazi, Tripoli, and other areas of the country. The Yemeni conflict will probably remain stalemated through at least mid-2016. Meanwhile, AQAP and ISIL's affiliates in Yemen have exploited the conflict and the collapse of government authority to recruit and expand territorial control. The country's economic and humanitarian situation also continues to worsen. Iran deepened its involvement in the Syrian, Iraqi, and Yemeni conflicts in 2015. It also increased military cooperation with Russia, highlighted by its battlefield alliance in Syria in support of the regime. Iran's supreme leader continues to view the United States as a major threat. We assess that his views will not change despite the implementation of the JCPOA deal, the exchange of detainees, and the release of the 10 sailors. In South Asia, Afghanistan is at serious risk of a political breakdown during 2016, occasioned by mounting political, economic, and security challenges. Waning political cohesion, increasingly assertive local power breakers, financial shortfalls, and sustained countrywide Taliban attacks are eroding stability. Needless to say, there are many more threats to U.S. interests worldwide that we can address, most of which are covered in our statement for the record, but I'll stop with a litany of doom and we'll address your questions.
Thank you, Director Clapper. I'm going to go first to Director Comey. Director, there's been a lot recently in the news, as you're well aware, involving the iPhone and that was owned by the San Bernardino shooter. What exactly are you asking Apple to do? How does this differ from the other times you have asked Apple to help you lawfully obtain communications?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In the case in San Bernardino, the judge, the federal judge, has ordered the maker of the phone to do two things. That is, disable the auto erase function on the phone so that if the FBI is trying to guess the passcode to the phone, it doesn't automatically delete the contents, essentially, after the 10th try. And second, to disable the delay between tries function so that if we're going to try to guess the code, it doesn't take years and years and years, but instead we're able to do it in minutes or in hours, and to do that through the remote pulsing of codes to the phone. That's what the order is about. And I don't know whether this particular relief has been sought in another court proceeding? I don't think so. Given the nature of this particular phone and its operating system, it's possible, but I'm not aware of it.
Well, I'm sure you're going to be getting more questions from this committee, and I know that you're testifying also, I think, next week before the Judiciary Committee.
Yes, I
know
am.
this has been an ongoing debate. I want to switch over to Director Stewart. On February 15th, 2016, the Daily Beast ran a long report titled, and I quote, "Whistleblowers Warn Top Spy About Skewed ISIS Intel." Shortly afterward, our committee was contacted and briefed by ODNI on the survey results, which indicated that over 40% of the analysts at CENTCOM feel there are problems with analytic integrity and CENTCOM processes. With troops and warfighting all over the CENTCOM AOR, is it appropriate that we wait 18 months or longer for the Inspector General report before we even begin to rectify these problems?
Mr. Chairman, I have no control over the pace at which the DODIG does its investigation. And so while it would be very good for all involved to get closure on exactly the extent of this allegation, we have no control over that process. And I probably won't comment any further on the investigation, but the survey itself represents just a sampling of the 16,000 plus members that we have in this enterprise, and an enterprise where we put very strict measures to ensure that we comply with analytic standards, to ensure that we have a process where those who believe that their views are not being heard through red teaming, through devil's advocate programs, through sampling of our products, we think we have in place a pretty good standard and pretty good approach to look at the quality of our analysis and the integrity of our analysis. And I'll leave it at that.
Well, it appears like at least there was a process in place to get input from the analysts. And to me, it seems like that 40% of analysts that are concerned at CENTCOM, that's just something that can't be ignored. Regardless of the investigation, I know that will take place. But if you have 40% of the analysts, I don't know if there's a way. Are you going to go back in and pull them again, or is this an annual process that the ODNI goes through? But what changes can be made in the short term with the I guess, for lack of a better term, the unhappiness of the analysts at CENTCOM?
This is an annual DNI process. We'll certainly continue to look at ways that we can improve our training. We've done that already. We've already had requests where there's been a dispute at CENTCOM, where we've sent our ombudsman there to look at the analytic rigor and to look at the different views. So we continue to do this process even as this investigation goes on.
Would you consider, though, the 40% to be unusually high, or is this a normal number?
I would consider that unusually high. Yes, Mr. Chairman.
Okay. Mr. Schiff.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director Comey, I want to ask you about the Apple case as well. The facts of the San Bernardino case are obviously pretty compelling in terms of wanting to know what's on that phone, whether there were other parties involved or other plans or targets of attack. And while that application, as you've pointed out, is focused solely on that phone, when I read the motion in support of the application under the All Writs Act, I don't see a limiting principle. And by that I mean that if that argument is accepted by the court in this case, won't it lead district attorneys and other prosecutors around the country to essentially make the same argument in their cases? And some of those may be compelling. I think you pointed to a pregnant woman who was murdered, I think in Arkansas, and the phone may be the only key to who her killer is. But nonetheless, that application may be good in misdemeanor cases involving nonviolent offenses. And so while the result may only affect this phone, the precedent will be there for many others. And I guess what I'd like to ask you is there a limiting principle here? Is there a way through negotiation that we can arrive at cases where it's appropriate to seek this relief and cases where it's not? Do you acknowledge sort of the broader policy implications of a uniform application under the All Writs Act. Now, I realize this may be mooted by the next generation of operating system, which may not allow this kind of relief, but nonetheless, if it is technologically feasible, even with the next generation operating system, for Apple to help with the opening of a phone, it seems to me that the argument you're making in this case will apply to those new operating systems as well. So is there a limiting principle here, and is there any way to resolve this through negotiation? Because at least the initial positions of the parties are, we need access when we have legal warrant, and the other side is saying we can never provide access because if we do here, we'll have to do it everywhere.
Okay. No, thank you, Mr. Schiff. And I should say I very much agree with the way you framed it in your opening statement. This case and all cases are very, very important, but there's a broader policy question that is far larger than any individual case that we all have to grapple with. But to the case, first, I think the answer would best come from a technical expert and a good lawyer. I'm neither of those, but I will take a shot at it. I do think that it is potentially, whatever the judge's decision is in California, and I'm sure it'll be appealed no matter how it ends up, will be instructive for other courts. And there may well be other cases that involve the same kind of phone and the same operating system. But what the experts have told me is the combination, here's where I'm going to get well out of my depth, of a 5C and this particular operating system is sufficiently unusual that it's unlikely to be a trailblazer because of technology being the limiting principle. But sure, a decision by a judge, the judge weighing a decision in Brooklyn right now, all of those decisions will guide how other courts handle similar requests. The All Writs Act, as you mentioned, is a tool that I used as a young prosecutor. We've used for hundreds of years so that courts can have their orders given effect, and how judges interpret that in any particular jurisdiction is not binding on others, but will be important. So I think that's fair to say. But I do think the larger question is not going to be answered in the courts and shouldn't be, because it's really about who do we want to be as a country and how do we want to govern ourselves.
Let me ask you about that broader policy question from the Bureau's perspective, and that is, can you live with a policy, can law enforcement live with a policy that says only in certain cases, whether they're violent crimes or other very serious cases, terrorism related, that we would allow under the All Writs Act? I mean, Congress could specify to which purposes the All Writs Act or a change to CLIA would apply. Is that something that the law enforcement community, intelligence community, you think, could negotiate with privacy stakeholders and with the technology sector?
I think conversation and negotiation is the key to resolving this. This is the hardest question I've seen in government, and it's going to require negotiation and conversation. But I've been very keen to keep the Bureau out of the policymaking business. I think we have two roles in this context. One is in the cases. We must do a competent investigation following the murder of 14 people in San Bernardino, and we will, and we'll use whatever lawful tools are available to us. But in the larger conversation, I think our role is just to make sure folks understand what are the costs associated with moving to a world of universal strong encryption. There's tons of benefits. I love encryption. I love privacy. And when I hear corporations saying, we're going to take you to a world where no one can look at your stuff, part of me thinks, that's great. I don't want anybody looking at my stuff. But then I step back and say, you know, law enforcement, which I'm part of, really does save people's lives, rescue kids, rescue neighborhoods from terrorists, and we do that a whole lot through court orders that are search warrants, and we do it a whole lot through search warrants of mobile devices. And so if we're going to move to a world where that is not possible anymore, the world will not end, but it'll be a different world than where we are today and where we were in 2014. And so we just have to make sure that the Bureau explains to folks what the costs are so that people don't look at us 5 years from now and say, where were you guys when this happened? This is too important to let us drift. And so my goal is to have the Bureau be a factual input so we have a really robust conversation that's well informed.
Well, thank you, Director. And I know my colleagues will have more questions, so I'm going to defer to them. There's one other matter I wanted to raise, though, and that's the subject of Libya. I'm deeply concerned that as the size of the tumor in Syria and Iraq decreases, that we're seeing the growth of a new malignancy in Libya. There seems to be a concern with taking more aggressive military action against ISIS in Libya, that it would somehow interfere with the ongoing, never-ending, it seems, negotiations to try to get the two political parties together and form a common government. From an intel perspective, do you think that we could take more aggressive military action against ISIS in parallel with the political negotiations, or do you think we have to choose between them? Because I'm concerned that at the pace of those negotiations, which seem endless, that we may get to the point where ISIS is so firmly entrenched in Libya that we have to embark on the same multi-year project that we're undertaking in Iraq and Syria.
Well, I'll start that, and then others can contribute. I think you've very aptly characterized the dilemma here is in terms of a more robust military intervention in Libya and the potential jeopardy that that then poses to a very fragile, evolving political process. There's great hope for this new government of national accord. We'd like nothing better than to have a government in place in Libya with whom we could work and from whom we could gain consent for engaging militarily in Libya. That is a subject of active discussion as I speak. John, do you want to add anything to that?
I think there is recognition that there is a relationship between government building, trying to get this government of national accord off the ground, and counterterrorism operations. And the discussions that I think Jim and I and others have been in recognize that sometimes what you do in one environment affects the other. But I think the purpose is to try to pursue both with vigor simultaneously, recognizing that you cannot put off the counterterrorism operations as this long process of government building continues to take place.
Just to drill down a bit further on that, do either of the political factions that are trying to form the common government, do either of them take issue with the necessity of military action against ISIS? I'm trying to get an understanding as to why, in an effort that I hope would be more fully integrated with European military leadership, a more aggressive approach against ISIS in Libya would somehow interfere with the political negotiations.
Well, the governments the two competing governments also are, neither of them are monolithic. There are a spectrum of political views within each one of those. So I think there is, to the extent that there can be in Libya, a fair amount of agreement that ISIL poses a threat to Libya as a nation state, and I think there is sentiment among the most parties, but not all, that this represents a threat to the country. But there is not, and that's the difficulty here, there is a wide range of views in the political spectrum in Libya.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Mr. Miller.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. As the chairman alluded to in his opening statement, there's a lot of education that's going to be taking place about Section 702, and Director Clapper, Brennan, Director Comey, if you would, in this open session, please elaborate briefly, if you will, how important Section 702 is to your respective agencies.
Well, I'll start, but and I would also invite Rick Ledgett, the Deputy Director of NSA, but all of us have an equity here. 702 represents a vital capability, intelligence capability for all of us. And just to be clear, this is the provision in the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act that governs the collection on non-U.S. persons overseas. And the current law expires in December of 2017. And so we are already embarked on kind of an education campaign in the Congress to ensure people understand what a vital tool this is. Let me turn first to Mr. Ledgett.
Thank you. Sir, I agree with what the director said, that it is in fact a vital tool for our intelligence efforts against valid foreign intelligence targets, non-U.S. persons who are overseas. And it does not permit the targeting of U.S. persons. That would require a separate court order to do that. In the course of conducting collection under Section 702, if a U.S. person is in contact with a valid foreign intelligence target, there are minimization procedures that we use to minimize the retention and the disclosure of the identity of that person because it's not of foreign intelligence value, and those are reviewed annually by the court.
702 is a critical tool for CIA for the collection of foreign intelligence as well as our operational activities, whether they be on the counterterrorism front, counterproliferation front, or as well as others. There have been numerous instances over the years where 702 has been instrumental in our ability to uncover and also help disrupt activities that are a threat to our national security interests. And as you can imagine, in open session, it's difficult to go into some of those. But let me just mention at least one. In late 2014, a longtime Libyan extremist operative was arrested by local authorities in Europe following several trips into Syria and Libya while he met with senior extremist operatives. At the time of his arrest, CIA assessed that he was involved in external operational planning, and CIA provided this lead information from Section 702 collection to assist the local government in their investigation that led to the arrest of that individual. That is, I think, it epitomizes in many respects the way that 702 intelligence is used by CIA, working frequently in concert with our partners around the world to disrupt these activities that frequently have a terrorist dimension to them or a proliferation dimension to them.
The only thing I'd add, Mr. Miller, is reasonable people could and did argue about how important the telephone metadata collection was. This is not even a close call. I mean, this is, if we lost this tool, it would be a very bad thing for us. And so it's very important to have this conversation early. So I thank you for the question.
Thank you, Mr. Comey. Yield back. Gentleman yields back, and Mr. Himes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, thank you for being here. Director Comey, I want to pick up the line of questioning on the Apple FBI. As Mr. Schiff said, the facts are compelling in this case. Some of the issues, as you have acknowledged, are novel and challenging. It is this body that should be determining the answer to the questions that you ask and that will be resolved in the judiciary. And, of course, we will once again shirk our constitutional duty as we have on an authorization for the use of military force, as we're preparing to do with respect to advice and consent on a Supreme Court nominee, and we will again on this issue, which is sad. So it leads me to two questions to you, Director, about, I guess, the thinking of the FBI. And the first question really is a follow-on to Mr. Schiff's. It's my understanding that the position of the FBI is a very narrow one, that the request of Apple really pertains to this device in this instance. There's a legitimate worry, though, that a decision in favor of the FBI could be the narrow end of a very wide wedge. And Mr. Schiff asked about the legal domain of cases to which this might apply. I want to ask about the authority. If the FBI prevails, Apple will be required to write some code at the behest of the government. My question is, where does this authority end? For example, is it the position of the FBI that it has the authority to compel the inclusion of code into a new device? Can you paint a very bright line for us with respect to where you think that authority ends that might reassure those people who say, where does it end?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Himes. I don't think I can by virtue of expertise or should by virtue of my role. I really do think the Department of Justice, the lawyers who are representing the government in this case, are best situated to do that. I think these are reasonable questions because judges on both coasts and probably in lots of other places are going to have to interpret what is the meaning of the All Writs Act and what is reasonable assistance. And I'm really not somebody qualified to offer you a good answer to that one.
Okay. So it's not, at this point in time, a belief of the FBI that the authority could go beyond what it has requested in this particular case?
Yeah, I actually have not thought of it. Here's the way I think of it. The FBI focuses on case and then case and then case. I've said this to folks, and I've said it because it's true. The San Bernardino litigation is not about us trying to send a message or establish some precedent. It really isn't. It's about trying to be competent in investigating something that is an active investigation. And so I don't know how lawyers and judges will think about what is the limiting principle on the legal side. I just don't know.
Okay, thank you. My second question really is about a different way to think about this. Right now we're having this conversation primarily in terms of the tension between privacy and security. But there's a different tension, which is security versus security. If you prevail, and if this code is written, presumably, as Mr. Schiff pointed out, it will be the subject of other requests for law enforcement. This code will exist, presumably on a server at Apple, and that creates a very substantial threat. It will, if this code exists on a server at Apple, it will presumably become the target of our sovereign adversaries, of criminal enterprises, of terrorists. And you don't need to think too hard to spin some pretty ugly scenarios. If that code gets out into the wild, now a terrorist entity maybe knows my precise location, gets photos of my children. So I wonder if you could give us a sense for, in taking the position that the FBI has, how did you think about the trade-off between the very compelling desire to get the information on this particular San Bernardino case with the risks that would be posed by the existence of this code should it exist and ultimately perhaps get out into the wild?
Yeah, again, I think that's something that the court is going to sort out, and it, I'm trying to be cautious in answering because I'm not an expert, but what the experts have told me, and I'm sure this will be sorted out by the judge, is the code the judge has directed Apple to write works only on this one phone. And so the idea of it getting out in the wild and working on my phone or your phone, at least the experts tell me, is not a real thing. And the second thing is that the code will be at Apple, which is, I think, done a pretty darn good job of protecting its code. Right before 2014, they were able to unlock any phone, and I don't remember any code getting out that let that ability loose upon the land. But again, I'm not an expert, and I do think that's something the judge is going to have to sort out.
Thank you, Director. Director Clapper, in my limited time, I wanted to thank you for raising the issue of cybersecurity in your written testimony. I wonder, agreements were made when the Chinese president visited our president. I wonder if you could characterize whether those agreements have been effective in reducing the amount of cyber espionage and cyber activity that we've seen out of China.
We could probably go into that in more detail in the closed session. As I indicated in my oral remarks, I think jury's out. We have seen some reduction, but I don't think we're in a position to say at this point whether they're in strict compliance, and we can go into that in more detail in the closed session.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. King.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just have two brief questions to Director Comey on Apple. One is, were there any negotiations between the FBI and Apple leading up to the court proceeding?
Yes, plenty.
There were.
And they're very helpful, by the way. I want to be sure people understand there are no demons in this dispute or the larger dispute. Apple's been very cooperative. We just got to a place where they were not willing to offer the relief that the government was asking for.
And secondly, just to knock down a media story, I've heard several people on in the media say that the FBI could do this if they wanted to, but they are trying to establish a case here. Just give you the opportunity to speak about that.
It's the product of people watching too many TV shows. I don't mind TV shows about FBI, but sometimes we're not as attractive or as technologically talented as we appear on TV.
Okay. Yeah. I yield back.
Mr. Quigley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, gentlemen. Diving a little deeper into Ukraine and Russians, I don't know who wants to comment on this first, but some sense of their strategic goals here. Obviously, the impact of sanctions is pretty dramatic to their economy. Is this, I guess, a frozen conflict, and what else can we anticipate?
Well, what's had the greater impact on Russia's economy has been the precipitate drop in the price of oil, where Ural crude is running around $37 or $38, if that, a barrel. And the planning factor that the Russians have consistently used in their budgeting is $50 a barrel. So sanctions have certainly contributed to that, but the major impact has been with oil. I think the Russians consider Ukraine little Russia. It's I think it's deeply steeped in their history and their culture, and so they're going to attempt to sustain influence, particularly in the two separatist republics of Donetsk and Luhansk. And obviously what the Russians most fear and they're most concerned about is Ukraine gravitating to the west more than it already has, meaning becoming part of the European Union or worse, NATO. So Russia will continue, I think, to, via proxies, the separatists, sustain their influence in the Ukraine in that manner.
Do you see the status continuing the way it is, or some? Obviously, there's renewed conflict at different times, but no dramatic change recently.
That's right. I think they will, for now, maintain more or less the status quo. That's creating some issues among the separatists from a morale standpoint, and a lot of the incidents that are occurring along the line that has been drawn via the Minsk agreement are occasioned by upstart separatists whom the Russians don't completely control. John, you want to add to that?
Well, there has been some movement as far as negotiations with the Minsk agreement, but there still is shortcomings as far as implementation of that. But your characterization of a frozen conflict, I think there's still uncertainty about how the Russians themselves are going to extricate themselves from this, which is taking a toll, in addition to the oil prices, but because of sanctions.
Well, given the economy, for whatever reasons, and the two conflicts they're most involved with, do you sense that Putin feels they have their hands full, or do you have concerns about efforts to destabilize the Baltic region?
Well, there are concerns about that, although right now that's more in the soft arena, if you will, in the information operations or cyber realm rather than hard military assault on the Baltics. That doesn't seem to be in the cards right now. I do think the Russians are preoccupied right now with Syria, and they've put a lot into that. They are confronting the possibility, I think, or considering whether they're going to put more ground forces in. Of course, I think the constraining factor for them is a memory of Afghanistan, getting into kind of a bottomless pit, and I think that does affect Russian thinking, and is one of the reasons why I think there is apparent interest in a cessation of hostilities.
Thank you, Jim.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Westmoreland is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank all of you for being here. Excuse my voice. Director Comey, this warrant that you went to the court to get, it was really no different of a process of what you do for a FISA or any other warrant that you would want to get to check on some evidence. I mean, you were just trying to get where you could get into the phone, not do anything else. Is that correct?
That's correct. As in thousands of other criminal investigations across the country, if we want to search, go to a federal judge, make a showing of probable cause to believe there is evidence relevant to the investigation on the device, and get a search warrant from the court for the device. And then what happened here is then, because the device was unable to be opened, the judge issued a separate order under this thing called the All Writs Act to try and give effect to the court's search warrant that told the manufacturer, you must assist in disabling this auto erase function so they can try and guess it and execute the search warrant.
Well, to me, just from a common man, I would think it's different if you've got two people that have killed 14 other folks in a terrorist attack, and you're just trying to get through the security code to get into the device versus some divorce lawyer trying to find out what a philandering husband may have been talking to. So I think there is a totally difference to that. And I think the American people sense that. These are people who have committed a crime. The next thing I wanted to ask is, we've been going through a lot of the Iran nuclear deal, and we have given them a large sum of money, different varying figures of that. But I know that a lot of your agencies take part in monitoring the financing of ISIL, and whether that's in Libya or Iraq or Syria. And how are we monitoring what the Iranians are able to do or are doing? And it's an open question. Any of you can jump in there as far as what these funds are, because to me it gives a perfect opportunity with them going to France and other places and making these large purchases. Just another great opportunity to laundry money.
So we can maybe go into detail in a closed session. I think I'd say here that of the money that was released or freed up by virtue of the JCPOA, that much of it is encumbered either for debt or for demanding domestic needs of the Iranian economy. And some money has flowed to, and the organization we worry most about, I guess, is the IRGC and particularly the Quds Force. Some money has flowed to them, but they not as nearly as much as they wanted. And I think as far as how tracking finances and financial data, this would be best, the details of that be best left to a closed session.
Thank you, sir. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Ms. Sewell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, gentlemen, for your testimony today. Director Clapper, I think I want to turn back to cybersecurity and wanted to see if you could talk a little bit about what you think your assessment is of the IC's, the intelligence community's ability to counter cyber threats, and talk a little bit about what you see as future threats that we would face and whether or not we were able to meet those challenges.
Well, the intelligence community's role in all this, of course, is classically the intelligence, that is to collect and analyze information on threats in the cyber domain. And then in support of others who are more directly responsible for either planning attacks or for defense. In our forthcoming budget, in fact, on our budget submission, and I'll speak to it next week, as to what we're actually investing or asking for in 2017. I think the general threat environment is quite daunting, both from the standpoint of the capability of the nation states, prime among them Russia and China, and then non-state actors. There is an inverse relationship between the capabilities that countries have, China and Russia being the most formidable, perhaps less threatening in terms of their intent, whereas you have second-tier countries of the likes of Iran and particularly North Korea, lesser capability.
What do you see as our ability to
greater
counter
intent.
those threats? How would you assess our ability to counter those threats?
Well, by countering them or collecting against them?
Both, actually.
Well, countering them in one dimension is, I think, our ability to defend, which is not just a government thing, but the private sector as well. So when you say defend, that's a big domain. I think our concern, our responsibility, and our intent, of course, is to be able to collect the threat information so we convey to those who are responsible for defending, and in the case of, say, Cybercom attacking, that they have the adequate intelligence to bring to bear for that.
With respect to space sector, can you tell us a little bit about, I know you have in your report more detail, but our ability to defend against or counter some of the Russian and Chinese anti-satellite missile systems.
Again, this is a subject best left perhaps in detail for closed session, but I'll just say that both the Russians and the Chinese have embarked on a very aggressive and versatile and diverse set of capabilities in the space domain. And this has prompted a lot of attention on both the part of the Department of Defense as well as the intelligence community to provide an array of defenses and resilience and reconstitution if necessary should we lose our valuable space assets. This is a commentary, I think, on both Russian and Chinese insight and understanding about how heavily the United States depends on space for a whole variety of needs.
Thank you. I yield back the rest of my time.
Gentlelady yields back. Dr. Heck.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you all for appearing here today and for your long service to our country, and through you, our thanks to the many men and women who your agencies represent. Director Comey, not to beat the Apple issue to death, but one quick question. Has Apple clearly articulated what their reasons are to not cooperate to the extent that you've requested? Is it the slippery slope, Fourth Amendment civil liberties, or is it more of an economic issue to them where their cooperation in showing the world that they might be able to accomplish what's requested makes their device less desirable and they therefore lose market share?
I don't think that's a question, Dr. Heck, that I can or should answer. Obviously, I don't want to talk about our private conversations in the course of this investigation about Apple. I know there's been a bunch of stuff in the press, and they'll obviously have an opportunity to file in the court, I think today or tomorrow, to explain why they don't believe the order is legally and factually appropriate. So I think I got to leave it there.
All right, I appreciate that. We'll wait for the court filing then to see what their claims may be, and I yield back, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Carson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Director Comey, without getting into classified territory, can you describe how the FBI makes a determination to determine which communities warrant proactive outreach and engagement to prevent radicalization and recruitment under the CVE umbrella?
I think so. Any community where either we or the community believe there is a risk of people turning towards violence, and sometimes that's a ethnic community, an immigrant community. Sometimes it's a particular community with a particular flavor of anti-government sentiment. So wherever there, especially young people who might turn to violence, there we try and engage with folks in that community.
Is the intention to include more of a holistic approach by bringing in not only the community leaders, but educators within the community, psychologists within the community?
Yes.
Yeah, to prevent the kind of self-radicalization that's taking place?
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
It has to be an entire community thing. Can't be a law enforcement thing, can't be a religious institution thing. It's got to be parents and educators and physicians and law enforcement and social workers. So one of the things the Bureau is trying to do as part of our Countering Violent Extremism effort is bring together those talented people from all different perspectives in the community. So especially if we encounter a young person who hasn't yet moved to the place where we're going to have to lock them up, that there's the prospect of a group coming together and redirecting that person. But it has to be a whole lot of folks besides us.
Has the Citizens Academy been an effective tool in creating some kind of buy-in with those communities?
Yes, because the Citizens Academy, which, Congressman, you know well, is an effort the FBI runs in all 56 of our field offices. We invite in people from all walks of life to spend time getting to know how we do our work, ask us hard questions, and then stay involved with us to give us feedback on how we're doing and to connect us to all different parts of the community. So it's a vital tool.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Dr. Winstrup is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I do want to thank all of you for being here, and as Dr. Heck said, all those that you represent and the work that you do. I have a question more for later in closed session, but one thing that I think we can't ignore as we sit here on the side of Congress, Admiral Mullen spoke years ago about our debt being a threat to our national security. And so I want to ask you, Director Clapper, as we face all these increased external threats to our nation, how does this basically an internal threat of our debt affect our capabilities and the work that you do?
Well, it affects us if to the extent that that has inhibition on our resources, meaning our funding. So that's why we've been very concerned about the impacts of sequestration, which we're not through yet. So in that respect, you know, it is a concern. I have to say that thanks to the Congress, we've done reasonably well in our funding requests, and I hope the same is true in 2017. Certainly, I'd just say as a citizen, I think I do worry about our debt and as a country, and so I worry about it from that respect.
Well, in the line of national security, I think that we need to continue to address your needs, and it's helpful to us when you discuss whether you have the appropriate wherewithal to do your job, and as we make decisions here. I thank you for that input, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Stewart is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and to you gentlemen, I express my appreciation and gratitude and sincerely on behalf of millions of Americans who may or may not recognize the really wonderful work that your organizations do and the many dedicated men and women who are sacrificed to do that. Thank you. I would like to, I suppose I could ask this question to nearly all of you, although Director Brennan or perhaps Mr. Comey as well, you might be best suited, although Mr. Leggett, I'd appreciate your opinion as well. In this conversation with Apple, which is taking a fair amount of our time here, the longer term problem, and we've had opportunities to talk about this with all of you, is the prospect that within a few short years we may be, you know, to use the phrase dark, with heavy encryption that doesn't allow us to use law enforcement mechanisms or national security tools. And I'm wondering if you would elaborate on what that really means. Could we help the American people understand that the encryption, which we may not control, they may not be U.S. companies that are developing this encryption, that it's becoming widely available, and how that's going to make it more difficult for you to keep us, as we expect, to keep American people safe? Director Comey, yes, if we could.
This is a problem that all of us in the intelligence community have been talking about to sound an alarm, because we see increasingly in our national security work, and the Bureau has significant criminal responsibilities in our criminal investigative work, increasing situations where we cannot, with lawful court orders, read the communications of terrorists, gangbangers, pedophiles, all different kinds of bad people. And with, again, lawful court orders and search warrants, we're increasingly unable to make that search warrant effective, and enter a device with a court's permission and get what's on there. That affects all of our work. You've seen it. This committee obviously knows a lot about it, most prominently in the counterterrorism side with ISIL, which is reaching into the United States, trying to motivate people to either come to their so-called caliphate or kill in the United States. And when they find someone they think will either come or kill, they move them to a mobile messaging app that's end-to-end encrypted that we can't read with court orders. And that is a big problem for us. There are substitutes around the edges of it. People talk about metadata, which is the information about who contacted whom. That's useful, but it's no substitute for knowing what they're talking about. Sometimes physical surveillance is useful. Sometimes informants are useful. But there really is no substitute. Anybody who knows our work will tell you this. There's no substitute for being able to have a judge order access to the content. And so our job is not to tell the American people what to do about it. We're just here to tell you there is a big problem, and that darkness is going to grow and grow and grow and change our world.
Director Brennan, would you or Mr. Leggett elaborate on that from more of an international perspective and the work we're trying to do overseas and encryption and how that affects that?
Well, I'll start, and then I know Rick will have some comments. One of the most important missions for CIA is the collection of foreign intelligence, and increasingly, because of the terrorist threat we face, we need to get that intelligence that resides within intelligence organizations. The ability of these terrorists to communicate with one another in manners that make it very difficult for us to uncover, it has been increasing, and it is very frustrating, but also very concerning, because they follow the press, they follow these discussions. They are very sophisticated. A lot of them have grown up at an era of technological revolution, and they've been able to take advantage of that. And so it has made our challenges very difficult. So from my perspective, on the foreign intelligence front, the more intelligence that we can obtain through our lawful authorities, the better able we are to protect the American people.
Yes, thank you, sir. I agree with both Director Comey and Director Brennan on the importance of this and the impact it has. We track when our foreign intelligence targets talk about the communication or the security of their communications, and we see a growing number of them because of the information that's in the press about the value of encryption, moving towards that in a way that inhibits our ability to understand what they're doing. And what Director Comey said about the difference between metadata and content is hugely important and often overlooked. It's one thing to know that a person is in a particular place at a particular time. It's something else entirely and necessary to understanding and defeating terrorist plots to know what the target is, what the timing is, how the attack is going to develop.
Well, and in conclusion, I would just say this. I appreciate your conversation with Apple, and Director Comey, you, I think, stated it well. This is a conversation that I think the American people need to have. We talked a little bit about 702 and you know, the pathway forward with that as well. But it seems to me that technologically some of these conversations may become moot because we may not have access to that information regardless, just because technology makes it impossible for us in the future. And how we grapple with that is something I think we should consider as well. But, Mr. Chairman, thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I want to thank the panel for the open session portion of the Worldwide Threats hearing. We will hopefully reconvene about 10:30 down in the classified spaces.